All right, what's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. As you guys have probably know if you've been watching some of the videos or some of the other stuff that I write and post and such, I'm obviously really interested in like the Federal Reserve and monetary policy and similar things in general. Um, but I also have somewhat of an academic background with academic research, specifically in physics. But because of that, I really like reading like academic articles and stuff. So like actual peer-reviewed stuff, the things that people. There we go. Uh, the light on the webcam was on, but it makes this weird ring thing in my glasses, and it just annoys me, and I feel like it doesn't actually show my face any better. But anyways, with academic articles and such, um, the whole science that everyone talks about, but I actually enjoy reading that kind of stuff. Um, and it's helpful. But anyways, I found something, or I guess my point is I don't want to get too sidetracked. Um, I look for that kind of stuff. And there's a few of them, but since they're so large or whatever, I haven't done videos yet because I've just been going through them bit by bit. For example, the one that I'm just basically going over the summary and showing you guys because the actual paper itself is 84 pages. So I haven't read it yet, but I want to, and I will. And then I'll kind of like show highlights and stuff. Because this is public information, you can literally just find this on the website, and I'll take you to the website where you can just find it and download the paper if you want to read it yourself. With that being said, let's just get straight into the screen share so you can see. I think it's this one. Yeah. Okay. So basically, this is it's the Harvard Law School Forum of Corporate Governance, which I didn't even know was a thing. And so I'll probably be visiting this website quite a few more times to find different articles and such. But the specific paper was written by Lev Menand. I'm assuming he's an associate professor of law at Columbia University or Columbia Law School. And it's basically about the Federal Reserve, the logic and limits of the Federal Reserve Act. Um, so the Fed repeatedly rescued over-leveraged financial companies, backstopped foreign financial institutions, and purchased trillions of dollars of mortgage-backed securities. In 2020, it even created a set of novel facilities to assist medium-sized enterprises and municipal governments, right? And this is one of the things that's kind of down the pipeline for the website and everything else is some of these more facilities that the Fed has created. Like there's, I think they set up like a permanent reverse repo facility that was made in 2020. I'm not 100% sure if it's for specifically the medium-sized enterprises. Oh wow, medium-sized enterprises and municipal governments, but we'll get into that later as we research more about it. But yeah, so basically, he proposes questions too. 'Cause it seems like it's an argument. Like I said, I haven't read the paper yet, but it's definitely interested. I already downloaded it. I plan on doing it at some point, at least recently. We'll see how work goes. But yeah, so if the Fed is able to create money to boost asset prices in financial firms, why shouldn't it directly tackle problems that hurt ordinary households and businesses? Um, and so basically, he posed this question, um, or they posed this question. I don't know if it's a he, she, or whatever. By the name, I haven't seen it before, so I don't know. But anyways, so basically there's different arguments on whether or not the Federal Reserve should actually be doing this kind of stuff and whether or not they should backstop certain markets and such. And there's arguments for both and stuff like that. And that's where he's getting this from what I've noticed, it seems rather unopinionated, which is nice. Um, Obviously there'll be some implicit bias, but it's not going to be like very, very obvious without reading the whole 84-page paper, which I will definitely do. But basically, and he says this here, I argue that to understand the Fed, including its place in the federal administrative state, its initiatives since 2008, and its various possible futures, it is necessary first to understand the U.S. system of money and banking, right? And so you have to understand the whole system as a whole, because it's really the context in which this stuff actually matters. Kind of like I've seen some really good arguments for quantitative easing, or not, I guess not for quantitative easing, but pertaining to quantitative easing. And actually, the guy who coined the term, um, Richard Werner, he um, he did so with the Bank of Japan in the 90s, I think. Anyways, I listened to him talk in person one time. And basically, he was like, yeah, quantitative easing does not do what people think it does. Um, and he started going on about like different types of quantitative easing and like how it changes depending on where exactly that asset swap is happening and a few other things. There's a lot of nuance to it. It's not just the whole money printing thing that people think it is, or at least mainstream people tend to think it is. Um, there's a lot of nuance to it. Um, but I think he has obviously has a paper on it. And I'll try to find it now that I think of it and do something with it. So, right, this brings up an interesting point of view that I never really thought about. This next statement, and we're going back to the summary, right? And so that system uses government chartered investor owned banks to issue most of the money supply. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, Congress constructed an elaborate legal regime to govern these banks, to the purpose of which was to render the delegation of monetary powers to private investors politically and economically durable. Right, and so this is a lot of the things that people tend to confuse. It's kind of the advent of the Federal Reserve in general. Um, I'm not as well versed, but I know the general pretext of it. So there's a book called The Creature of Jekyll Island, which that creature is the Federal Reserve. And so essentially, if I remember correctly, it was major bankers like J.P. Morgan, the actual person, not the bank, or well, I guess as of the bank, but the person who created the bank, right? The actual person, J.P. Morgan, and a few other major investors, and I think there was a few like ex-congressmen out there as well, but they literally met at like Jekyll Island in Georgia, at a mansion, and planned this thing over like a week or whatever. And then that was later proposed to Congress and basically sold to them through like lobbying and stuff like that to make it seem like it was their idea. And then it ran with it. But really, the banking system and the Federal Reserve, people think the Federal Reserve is a public entity. It's not, right? It's kind of this weird mix of private and public interest, right? Where the banking system is private, right? But the Fed is kind of that weird, it's like the top, I guess you could say top of the hierarchy almost, kind of like a capstone or whatever. And it's like a mixture between the two. And I went into one of these. It has to deal with like how the different like the directors are um elected, right? And who they're supposed to represent. So like there's class A, class B, and class C directors. And then like I think class A and B are kind of appointed or elected from by private means, and then class C is appointed by like through public means, right, through some form of government entity. um I wrote a post on that with a graphic kind of making it easier to see, and you can find that information on the Federal Reserve website as well. um so yeah, so he also, let's see. So I argue today's Fed is built to address three problems with monetary outsourcing that contemporary scholars and commentors tend to overlook, underplay, or misunderstand. Right. Um, so kind of the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve, right? That's the whole point, and that's why it's the logic behind the Federal Reserve Act. And then he goes later on to see the limits, which comes into these three problems, I believe. So deflation and monetary contraction is the first problem, which is the tendency of the investor-owned banking system to intermittently shrink its collective balance sheet, generating economic instability and unemployment. Right. Um, That's one of those. I can see some form of corollary between this and I think it's Schumpeter's creative destruction with like capitalism. Businesses and banks need to fail. Um, you just need it, else you get malinvestment and things just go awry. Right? And so there's also maldistribution, which is kind of related to what I just said, which is the propensity of profit oriented bank managers to mistreat smaller competitors, issue new money unevenly across the country, and divert resources towards speculative activities. I don't think anyone who's been paying attention to either markets or just banking in general has much of an argument against what was just said. I think that's rather consensus, at least from the sources that I've been reading and what I've been hearing about over the years. Um, so there's that. And then the third problem is a lack of public accountability and control, the inability of traditional government regulators to address problems like deflation and maldistribution, leading to a politically destabilizing legitimacy gap. Yeah. So that's not very, I don't think that's a, I don't think many people would argue against that to begin with, the fact that, there's not that much accountability within the system and stuff like that. Everyone pretty much distrusts banks in general, at least the major ones. Um, but also one of the things that kind of makes sense to me, and was kind of in the back of my head, but it wasn't until I read this sentence that it really popped. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. The Fed's 12 regional banks reflect the role of investor interests in and diffuse the nature of the American banking system. And the Fed's independence from the president is consonant with a 3-century history of insulating monetary functions from executive control. Okay. And this kind of, I can see where this would play with like separations of powers and stuff. Not necessarily, I mean, that's typically given in like a government context where it's like the 3 different branches of government. But what I mean is like throughout history, when you see when the creation and supply of money or just monetary policy in general is run purely from a public perspective, so governments, um, it typically and rarely ends well. Um, Actually, there's been no, well, I don't want to say that just yet, but I mean, when monetary policy is purely a political phenomenon and there's no private interest in it really, you see things that are obviously not advantageous for general people, right? For the general public. So talking like, and it seems to me from what I've read and such that, when that's the case, the let's see, the system falls apart much quicker. Is kind of my point. Um, Anyways, this is supposed to be a summary and not a whole hour-long video, hopefully. But another thing that I'm not as well versed in again, but I'm aware of and I want to study more is shadow banking. And this kind of plays into the whole, at least from my understanding, the whole like euro dollar system and how all that works, right? And so he says the rise of shadow banks, firms that issue alternative forms of money without a bank charter, has impaired the Fed's traditional tools for managing the money supply, which could possibly be why the Fed has to result into more and more drastic measures to get the same result. I guess you could see that's one argument. Another argument would be, like stuff like quantitative easing. It's like a drug for the economy, right? So the more the economy develops a tolerance, and so you have to keep giving more and more in order for it to still have the same effect. And another argument for that I've heard is basically that, like, the economy and complex systems like that, they don't react to absolute levels, right? And so you have this much money at this level, right? They react to the change in that level. So when this goes up, so let's just start at like 1 million, just for easy numbers and to get the concept down. And so if you have like $1 million in the system, right? And then you move it to $2 a system in a year, or $2 million in the system for a year. So you double the money supply, right? It's that change from 1 to 2 million that will spark that growth, right, so to speak, from the Keynesian point of view. Um, and so basically, you have to keep the money supply changing at that $1 million per year to maintain that same amount of growth. And then you have the whole diminishing returns and stuff, the law of diminishing returns, to where at some point continuing that rate won't have the same effect. And so from there, you have to increase the rate, which is why you see like kind of an exponential curve with stuff. And I showed a graph in my recent post, what's the title? Where I talked about the different frameworks for the different monetary policy frameworks the Fed uses for a limited amount of reserves in the system and an ample amount of reserves in the system. And I showed a graph of the amount of bank reserves in the banking system, I think it was specifically the amount of reserves held by depository institutions, right? And there's a very obvious change. It literally goes from like 40 something billion up into January 2008, I believe. And then basically at the end of 2020, it was well over 4 trillion. So that's a well over 100x move in the amount of bank reserves. And so that's a pretty big rate of change. But yeah, not to get too far down another rabbit hole. So and then it seems like he'll also have an argument in here. So while Congress designed the Fed to oversee a monetary system centered on chartered banks, the Fed has evolved to manage a system in which unchartered shadow banks predominate. And so basically the evolution of the Federal Reserve and what it must be doing is also in here too. Anyways, I put a link to this specific web page in the description so that you guys can go to it, and you can actually download the article here and then read it. But I think it's like 84 pages or something equivalent. So it's definitely not too, I guess it depends on your perspective on whether or not it's a light read. But yeah. So that's pretty much all for this one. Definitely something interesting, and that will be further down the pipeline. But that's all I got for this one. So I hope you guys have a good day, and I'll see you on the next one.